on the east side of the city, in one of those tired old apartment complexes where the paint on the hallway walls was cracked and the elevators rattled like bones, the night was heavy and quiet. Midnight had come and gone. The streets outside were empty, the only sound the occasional hum of a passing car or the bark of a restless dog. Inside, most residents were fast asleep, cocooned in the safety of locked doors and drawn curtains. But for one man drifting through the darkness, the night was just beginning. He was a burglar, not a professional, not someone with a plan or a crew. Just a desperate man with too many mistakes behind him and not enough money in his pocket. He had spent the evening drifting through bars, nursing cheap whiskey until his courage steadied into something like recklessness. When his last dollar was gone, when the bartender's glare told him he wasn't welcome any longer, he stumbled into the night with one thought circling his mind. Find cash. Find something worth taking. The building he chose wasn't random. He had been there before, loitering outside, noticing who came and went. He'd seen her, the young woman on the third floor, always walking alone, earbuds in, barely acknowledging the world around her. She lived alone. No boyfriend, no roommate. Perfect. The lock on the back entrance was weak. He slipped inside, careful to keep his steps light, even though the hallway stank of mildew and old carpet. A flickering fluorescent bulb buzzed above him, painting his face in sickly light as he made his way up the narrow stairwell. By the time he reached her door, his pulse had settled into the rhythm of someone who had done this before. He slipped a screwdriver into the frame and pressed. A soft click answered him. The door eased open. Inside, the apartment was still, silent. A faint smell of lavender drifted out. The scent of a candle burned earlier in the night. He closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment, listening. No sound. His eyes adjusted to the dim glow of the digital clock blinking on a small counter. He moved quickly, opening drawers, rifling through a purse left on the kitchen table. A couple of crumpled bills. Loose change. Not enough. He cursed under his breath. He checked the living room. Nothing worth more than a few bucks at a pawn shop. His jaw tightened. He wanted more. Needed more. And then his gaze fell toward the bedroom door, left ajar just enough for a sliver of darkness to spill into the hallway. He crept closer, silent as a shadow. Inside, she was there, the woman he had noticed so many times. Lying on her side, sheets tangled around her legs, chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of sleep. The glow from a streetlight outside fell across her face. Peaceful, vulnerable. He froze in the doorway, his breath caught in his throat. For a moment, the plan was still simple. Grab anything of value, slip out, vanish into the night. But the longer he stood there, the more another thought began to claw at him, stronger, darker. He felt it coil in his gut. Not just greed now, but hunger of a different kind. The apartment was silent, the city outside oblivious. No one would know. No one would hear. His hand tightened around the knife he carried. A small blade, more for intimidation than use. He stepped into the room, slow, careful, each board underfoot threatening to betray him. She stirred once, a small movement, but did not wake. He reached the side of the bed and stood over her. The burglar's breathing quickened, hot and shallow. He wasn't thinking about money anymore. He wasn't thinking about pawn shops or whiskey. His mind was clouded, consumed by the sudden, overpowering urge to take what he wanted, to assert himself over this woman who had no idea she was no longer alone. Somewhere, deep down, he knew he was crossing a line he could never step back from. But in the darkness of that cramped bedroom, with the weight of desperation and rage pressing against his skull, that voice of reason was barely a whisper. He reached out, his shadow falling across her body, and nudged the sheets aside. The city outside slept peacefully, unaware that in this quiet apartment, a nightmare was about to unfold. The first touch made her stir. Her eyelids fluttered, and for one suspended moment, he thought she might scream. But she didn't. She blinked up at him, confusion etched faintly on her face, then froze when she saw the blade glinting faintly in his hand. "Don't," he hissed, voice low, roughened by whiskey and nerves. The threat hung in the air like a noose. Her body tensed, shoulders rising slightly from the mattress, but no sound came from her lips. Instead, she swallowed hard, eyes fixed on him, wide with fear yet strangely controlled. "Please," she whispered. It was not the kind of shriek he had braced himself for. No pounding fists on the wall, no neighbors alerted. Just one word, soft, trembling, enough to give him the confidence to lean closer. His heart pounded against his ribs, half from adrenaline, half from something darker. He pressed the flat of the blade against her arm, just enough to remind her who was in control. "You keep quiet," he muttered. "Do what I say, and you won't get hurt." The lie rolled off his tongue with ease. He didn't even know if he believed it. She nodded faintly, eyes glistening in the dim light. Then, with a movement that startled him, she shifted slightly to the side, as though allowing him space. He faltered, thrown off balance. He expected struggle, resistance, anything but this subdued compliance. A twisted thought rooted in his head. Maybe she had given up. Maybe she was too scared to fight. Maybe deep down she knew there was no escaping him. The more he tried to rationalize it, the less he heard the faint warning voice screaming somewhere in the back of his mind. He leaned closer, the scent of her skin filling his nose, a faint trace of lavender and sweat. His pulse thundered. His grip tightened on the knife, though it trembled in his hand. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had come here for money, quick and clean, not this, but now that he had crossed the threshold, there was no turning back. "Good girl," he whispered, words sickly and hollow. He set the knife on the nightstand within reach, freeing his hands, feeling the rush of control surge through him. He climbed onto the bed, looming over her. She didn't push him away, didn't claw, didn't scream. Her eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, jaw clenched, body stiff but still. That eerie calm both unnerved him and fanned the fire in his chest. The room was thick with silence, broken only by the sound of his ragged breathing. He mistook her passivity for surrender, twisted it into a permission that was never given. Each movement he made fed the illusion that she was yielding to him willingly. "See," he muttered under his breath, almost to himself. "This ain't so bad." She turned her head slightly, eyes meeting his for the first time. They were glassy but sharp, as if she was silently telling him she knew what was happening, and that she would survive it, somehow, even if her body didn't resist. The look unsettled him. For a flicker of a second, he felt smaller than he wanted to be, like she had stripped away the illusion of power he clung to. But he shook it off, burying the unease under force. He pressed himself against her, his hands clumsy and aggressive, convinced that domination would erase the doubt building inside him. The knife glimmered faintly on the nightstand beside them, a reminder of the violence waiting in the wings. He didn't reach for it, not yet, but its presence lent him an invisible armor, telling him he was untouchable in this moment. Her stillness, her eerie quiet, gnawed at him. He wanted her to react, to fight, to cry, to give him a reason that would make what he was doing feel less like a choice and more like inevitability. But she didn't, and the silence made his thoughts louder. He had gone too far now. Even if he backed out, even if he fled, the damage was done. His fingerprints, his face, his crime, all burned into her memory, and he couldn't let that stand. The realization slithered into his brain like a snake. There was no walking away without consequences. His breathing grew harsher. The room felt tighter. The shadows around the bed seemed to press closer. He convinced himself that finishing what he started was the only way forward, that she had already given in, that fate had already decided. In the dim light of that cramped apartment bedroom, desperation and lust twisted into something uglier, a decision sealed by silence, by fear, by the fragile thread snapping inside his head. And as his hands pressed harder, his mind raced faster. One thing became chillingly clear. This wasn't just about taking what didn't belong to him anymore. It was about destroying it. His breath was ragged, sweat dripping down his temple, the blade of a knife catching a faint glimmer from the streetlight outside. He thought he had broken her. He thought she was nothing more than a body to be taken and discarded. But then, in a single disorienting moment, his illusion cracked. As his hands moved lower, fumbling and forceful, something didn't feel right. His brow furrowed, confusion flooding the haze of lust and violence. He froze, his breathing stopping short. His eyes darted down, searching, touching, trying to make sense of what his instincts were screaming. And then it hit him, the truth, sharp as lightning. She wasn't who he thought she was. The woman beneath him wasn't, in his eyes, a woman at all. She was transgender. At first, his mind went blank. Then came the rush, a tidal wave of rage, shame, and confusion that threatened to swallow him whole. His lips twisted into a snarl, eyes blazing wide. "What the hell?" he spat, jerking back as though the discovery had burned him. She turned her head, eyes glassy but steady. "Please, just stop," she whispered, voice breaking but calm in its desperation. Her words were gasoline on a fire already roaring out of control. To him, her quiet plea wasn't humanity, it was betrayal. He felt mocked, duped, made into a fool. In his warped logic, she wasn't the victim anymore. He was. "You tricked me." His voice cracked the silence, jagged and venomous. He shoved her down harder, the knife trembling in his hand. "You think this is funny? You think you can fool me like this?" Tears slipped down her temples, but she didn't fight. She just shook her head, lips trembling, trying to form words that might defuse the storm raging above her. But it was too late. He wasn't listening. Humiliation curdled into fury. The weight of every failure, every insult, every night spent stewing in self-loathing fused together in that single instant. She became the embodiment of all of it, a target for his rage, his shame, his need to prove he wasn't weak, wasn't small, wasn't less than. He lashed out. The blade flashed, a streak of metal in the dim room. She gasped, body jerking under the sudden bite of steel. The sheets darkened with spreading red. Still, he didn't stop. The shock of that first strike only fed him, numbing the last sliver of conscience that might have told him to stop. Blow after blow, the knife rose and fell, his hands slick, his breath feral, the room echoing with the guttural sounds of violence. She tried to shield herself, arms raised weakly, but her strength faltered quickly. Her voice broke into sobs, half-screamed pleas that choked into silence as the wounds multiplied. It was over in minutes, though it felt eternal. By the time he stopped, chest heaving, the room was drenched in horror. Her body lay twisted, blood soaking into the mattress, her eyes wide open but lifeless, fixed on the ceiling as if staring past him into something beyond. The knife clattered from his hand to the floor. He staggered back, staring down at what he'd done. The silence that followed was deafening. No more labored breathing. No whispers. No life. Only the faint hum of the city outside, oblivious to the atrocity inside those four walls. For a fleeting moment, clarity tried to break through. His mind screamed at him to run, to get out, to vanish before anyone discovered. He wiped his hands on his shirt, smeared crimson across the fabric, and stumbled toward the door. But before he left, he glanced back. The sight of her, the girl he thought he'd dominate, the woman he decided to punish for existing, seared into his brain. He muttered under his breath, voice cracking, "You did this. You made me," as if the lie could erase the truth of what he had chosen to do. The air felt heavier, thicker, pressing against his chest as he fled the apartment, leaving behind nothing but silence, blood, and the hollow echo of his own rage. By the time the building settled back into stillness, she was gone. Her body, broken and silent, lay in the dark, waiting for the world to discover what had happened when cruelty met innocence in the dead of night. The sun rose without ceremony over the apartment complex, casting pale light across chipped brick walls and broken blinds. For most of the tenants, morning was just another routine. Coffee brewing, radios humming, children thudding down the hallway on their way to school. But behind one closed door on the third floor, silence lingered, thick and unnatural. The woman who lived there had always been predictable. She left early each morning, earbuds in, a small thermos of coffee in hand, nodding politely at neighbors who passed her in the stairwell. That day, her door stayed closed. By noon, the mail still sat untouched in her box, and the neighbor across the hall, an older woman who noticed everything, began to feel uneasy. She knocked gently at first. "Hey, you okay in there?" No answer. She waited, frowned, and tried again, this time harder. Still nothing. A faint smell tickled her nose, something metallic and wrong drifting into the hallway crack by crack. Her stomach tightened. She didn't dare open the door, but she picked up the phone and dialed 911. When the officers arrived, the hallway was already buzzing with whispers. Tenants had gathered, exchanging nervous glances, speaking in low tones. Something bad had happened. They all knew it, even before the uniforms pushed through the crowd. "Step back," one officer said, firm but calm. He pressed his ear against the door, then tried the knob. Locked. He exchanged a glance with his partner, then motioned toward the frame. Within seconds, a steel bar was wedged between the door and the jamb. With a sharp crack, the lock splintered. The smell hit them first. Stronger now, unmistakable, blood, coppery, and stale. They pushed inside, guns drawn, eyes scanning the shadows. The apartment looked ordinary at first glance. Dishes in the sink, clothes draped over a chair, a candle burned down to wax. But the trail of dark stains smeared along the floorboards pulled them toward the bedroom. Each step deepened the dread until they reached the doorway. And then they saw her. She was sprawled on the bed, sheets soaked through with dried crimson. The air was heavy with it. Her body bore the savage truth of what had been done to her. Wounds scattered across her torso, arms stiffened in a final attempt to shield herself. Her eyes were open, glassy and fixed on nothing, frozen in a silence that screamed louder than anything else in the room. One officer swore under his breath and turned away. The other pulled his radio, voice clipped and steady. "We have a body. Female. Multiple stab wounds. Scene secured. Requesting homicide." Within minutes, the apartment was flooded with movement. Crime scene techs hauling in equipment, detectives ducking under yellow tape, neighbors pressed against the hall, trying to glimpse inside. Cameras flashed. Gloves rustled. The hum of official voices replaced the hush of death. Detective Ramirez, a seasoned investigator with lines etched deep into his face, stepped into the bedroom and stopped cold. He'd seen plenty of bodies in his career, but something about the brutality here, the overkill, the fury behind each wound, told him this wasn't just about theft or even lust. This was rage, personal and venomous. He scanned the room. The knife on the floor, smears of blood leading toward the door, the overturned nightstand. And then, details that spoke of who she was. Photographs taped to the wall, smiling with friends, holding a puppy, attending a pride march downtown. Makeup lined neatly on the dresser, a diary half hidden under a book. Little fragments of a life interrupted. Ramirez knew the press would eat this alive once they got wind. A transgender woman murdered in her own home. He could already hear the headlines forming, the debates waiting to ignite. But for now, she wasn't a symbol. She was just a victim, and his job was to find who had done this to her. He crouched, studying the blood patterns. The struggle had been brief. She hadn't stood much of a chance. His eyes shifted to the doorframe. No forced entry beyond the splintered lock they had just broken. That meant someone had either picked it or slipped in before she even woke. Back in the hallway, neighbors were interviewed one by one. A few had noticed a shadowy figure wandering outside late at night. One man muttered about footsteps in the stairwell around 2 a.m. Another recalled hearing muffled noises, maybe a thud, maybe a cry, but shrugged it off, thinking it was just another couple fighting. Piece by piece, the picture grew clearer. Someone had broken in while she slept. Someone had turned her home, her sanctuary, into the place where her life ended. As the body was wheeled out under a black sheet, the hallway fell silent. Neighbors bowed their heads, some whispering prayers, others holding back tears. For them, she wasn't just another statistic. She was the quiet woman from 3B, the one who smiled shyly but always said hello. Outside, reporters had already gathered, drawn by scanner chatter and the sight of flashing lights. Cameras pointed at the stretcher, microphones thrust toward anyone willing to speak. The story was no longer just about a murder. It was about identity, violence, and the darkness that had crept into their building overnight. And as Detective Ramirez lit his cigarette on the curb, staring at the chaos around him, he knew this case was going to haunt more than just the victim's neighbors. It was going to shake the city. Detective Ramirez didn't go home that night. He sat in the small conference room of the precinct, walls plastered with faded wanted posters and corkboards layered with pushpins. The smell of burnt coffee hung thick in the air. In front of him lay a stack of initial reports, photos spread across the table. The bedroom, the bloodied sheets, the knife glinting under camera flash. Each picture told the same story. Rage. Overkill, Ramirez muttered, tapping one photo with his pen. This wasn't about stealing a TV or a wallet. This was personal. His partner, Detective Harris, younger and sharper in tone, leaned back in his chair. Or maybe it was about control. About making her pay for something she had no control over. Look at the wounds. That's not robbery. That's anger. They both knew cases like this rarely stayed confined to the evidence. The moment the media learned the victim was transgender, the city would split into lines of sympathy, outrage, and prejudice. But Ramirez tried to strip all that away. At the core was a human being, dead, and someone who thought they could get away with it. The forensic team had pulled prints from a knife handle and the nightstand. A set of bloody shoe prints tracked faintly toward the door. There was also DNA under the victim's nails, proof she had tried, however briefly, to fight back. Lab results would take time, but Ramirez's gut already told him the killer hadn't planned this well. Whoever he was, he had left pieces of himself all over that room. By morning, interviews had begun. Neighbors filled the small lobby, whispering among themselves, some clutching coffee cups like talismans against the horror upstairs. One woman swore she'd heard footsteps in the stairwell just after 2 a.m. A man admitted he'd seen a figure loitering near the back entrance earlier that evening, hood pulled low, hands jammed in his pockets. Nobody had called in. It was just another sketchy guy, they said. Ramirez took notes, his pen scratching steadily across the pad. Sketchy guy. Hood. 2 a.m. It wasn't much, but it was a trail. Meanwhile, the victim's identity was confirmed. Her name was Lena Torres, 29 years old. She had moved into the building 3 years earlier, worked part-time at a bookstore downtown, and volunteered on weekends at an LGBTQ+ support center. Friends described her as quiet, thoughtful, with a sly sense of humor that came out once she felt comfortable. She had lived much of her life in silence, fighting to be recognized as who she truly was. And in the end, the world had silenced her permanently. Ramirez read through her file, his jaw tightening. She had been open about her transition among friends, but cautious around strangers. The evidence in her apartment, hormone prescriptions in the bathroom cabinet, personal letters tucked in drawers, told of a long, difficult journey. It also explained why her killer might have erupted the way he did. To someone twisted by ignorance and anger, the discovery of her identity might have been enough to ignite violence. But knowing motive didn't mean knowing who. The detectives widened the search. Security cameras in the area were checked. One grainy clip from a convenience store down the block showed a man in a dark hoodie buying cigarettes just after midnight. He fit the vague description from neighbors. His face wasn't clear, but his build was stocky, his gait heavy. Ramirez froze the frame. This could be him. Background checks turned up a name that kept circling back. Derek Shaw, 34, with a record for burglary, assault, and drug possession. He'd been in and out of county jail for years. And 2 months earlier, he'd been arrested less than a mile from Lena's building, caught trying to pry open a back door. Ramirez leaned back, staring at Shaw's mugshot. The hollow eyes, the sneer. He'd seen men like this before, drifting, desperate, capable of anything when cornered. Get a warrant, Ramirez said. We bring him in. When I knocked on Shaw's door 2 days later, the apartment reeked of stale booze and sweat. Shaw tried to slam it shut, but the uniforms were faster. Inside, the place was a wreck. Empty bottles, broken furniture, dirty clothes. And there, shoved in her pile of laundry, was a pair of sneakers smeared with faint, dried stains. The soles matched the bloody prints from Lena's floorboards. At the station, Shaw slumped in the interrogation room, eyes darting like a trapped animal. Ramirez slid the crime scene photos across the table. "She didn't deserve what you did to her," he said quietly. Shaw sneered. "She lied. She tricked me. You don't get it. She wasn't even." Ramirez slammed his hand down, cutting him off. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare blame her. You broke into her home. You pulled a knife. You had the choice to walk away, and you chose to kill her." Shaw's voice cracked into a defensive shout. "She wasn't real." The room went still. Ramirez leaned forward, his face inches from Shaw's. "She was more real than you'll ever be. And now, she's gone because of you." The evidence was damning. DNA under Lena's fingernails matched Shaw. The shoes were his. His prints were on the knife. He had no alibi, no explanation that wasn't steeped in hate. The case was airtight. But outside the precinct walls, the story was already spiraling. Headlines blared. Transgender woman murdered in apartment. Killer claims he was tricked. Community demands justice. Comment sections filled with bile and sympathy alike. Protesters gathered at the courthouse steps, holding candles, chanting Lena's name. Detective Ramirez felt the weight of it pressing down on him. It wasn't just about one murder anymore. It was about a society still unwilling to see people like Lena as worthy of protection, as worthy of life. And Shaw's excuse, "She wasn't real," was the same tired poison that had fueled too many graves already. The investigation was closed. The suspect was caught. But for Ramirez, it wasn't closure. It was a reminder of how easily prejudice could turn a moment into a death sentence. And as he filed the last report that night, he knew the trial ahead wouldn't just be about Shaw. It would be about Lena, about her dignity, about whether the court, the city, the country could look at her life and see it for what it was: human, valuable, stolen far too soon. The air in the interrogation room was heavy with the hum of fluorescent lights. Derek Shaw sat slouched in the metal chair, wrists chained to the table, his jaw set in defiance. His hoodie, confiscated when he was booked, now lay folded in an evidence bag outside. He wore a plain white shirt stained at the collar, a picture of a man who had stopped caring about appearances long ago. His eyes flicked constantly to the mirrored wall, as if trying to see who was behind it. Detective Ramirez entered slowly, a file tucked under his arm. He dropped it onto the table with a thud. The sound made Shaw flinch, though he quickly covered it with a sneer. "You already know why you're here," Ramirez said, his voice calm but sharp. He slid a crime scene photo across the table. The edges of the image caught the light. Lena's bedroom, soaked in red. "That's what we walked into. That's what you left behind." Shaw's face hardened. He leaned back, forcing a scoff. "I told you already. She lied to me. Tricked me. You don't get it." Ramirez leaned forward, his eyes locked on Shaw's. "No, you don't get it. You broke in her home. You threatened her. You forced yourself on her. And when you realized who she was, you didn't stop. You killed her. That's not being tricked, Shaw. That's murder." Shaw's lips curled. "She wasn't what she said she was. She..." The detective slammed his palm against the table, cutting him off. "Don't you dare try to rewrite this. She was a human being. She deserved to live. You took that away because you couldn't handle your own anger." For a moment, silence swallowed the room. Shaw's eyes flickered, searching for something: pity, understanding, a crack he could slip through. But Ramirez's gaze was unrelenting. Finally, Shaw spat out his defense. "I didn't go there to kill anyone. I just wanted money. That's it. But when I found out she was a freak..." The detective's jaw tightened. He slid another photo forward, this time of the bloody knife with Shaw's fingerprints highlighted in yellow marker. "Your prints. Your shoes match the tracks. Her DNA under your nails. We have it all. Stop lying." Shaw shifted in his chair, chains clinking. "You don't understand. Guys like me, we got standards. I couldn't." "Standards?" Ramirez barked out, a humorless laugh. "You broke into her home in the middle of the night with a knife in your hand. You forced yourself on her. And you think you get to talk about standards?" He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "The only standard you'll be living by from now on is prison food, Shaw. Because that's where you're going." Shaw's bravado cracked for a split second. His eyes darted to the mirrored glass, sweat beginning to bead at his temple. He opened his mouth, then closed it, lips pressing into a thin line. Detective Harris entered then, carrying another folder. "We just got the DNA confirmation," she said, loud enough for Shaw to hear. "It's him, 100%. She set the papers on the table and gave Shaw a look of contempt before leaving. The words landed like a hammer. Shaw slumped deeper into his chair, muttering curses under his breath. "She should have told me," he said finally, voice low, bitter. "If she had, maybe I would not have done it." Ramirez shook his head. "You had every chance to walk away. You chose not to. You chose violence. That's on you." For hours, the interrogation circled back and forth. Shaw oscillated between denial and justification, between bluster and silence. He admitted to breaking in, admitted to holding the knife, admitted to forcing himself on Lena, but he clung to his excuse like a lifeline. To him, saying he was tricked was the only way to soften the horror of what he'd done. By the time the statement was typed and signed, there was no doubt left. The evidence told one story, and Shaw's words only confirmed it. He had entered Lena's home with intent to steal, escalated to sexual assault, and when faced with a truth he couldn't accept, he let rage turn to murder. The next weeks were a blur of paperwork and hearings. Shaw was officially charged with burglary, sexual assault, and first-degree murder. The courtroom filled with reporters, their pens scratching furiously as the charges were read. Protesters outside held signs with Lena's name, demanding justice, their chants echoing through the courthouse walls. Inside, Shaw kept his posture defiant, but his eyes betrayed him. Each time the prosecution laid out the evidence, the blood on his shoes, the prints on the knife, the bruises on Lena's body, his jaw clenched tighter, his shoulders hunched lower. His defense attorney tried to spin the story. Heat of passion, provocation, a man blindsided and humiliated. They painted him as someone who lost control, not a monster who planned to kill. But the jury saw through it. The photographs, the testimony from neighbors who'd heard strange noises that night, the forensics, it all built a wall he couldn't climb. And when Lena's friends took the stand, describing her kindness, her struggles, her determination to live authentically despite the world's cruelty, the contrast was unbearable. The courtroom grew still, some jurors visibly moved. As one friend choked back tears, she wasn't trying to fool anyone. She was just trying to live. Shaw's gaze fell to the table then, no sneer left on his lips. For the first time, the weight of what he had done seemed to press down on him in front of everyone. But remorse never came, only silence. Detective Ramirez sat in the back, watching it unfold. He knew the verdict would be harsh, and he knew it wouldn't bring Lena back. But maybe, just maybe, it would send a message that excuses built on prejudice and hate could never erase the truth of a crime so brutal. When the gavel finally fell, the sound echoed like finality. Shaw was led away in chains, his eyes hollow, his life reduced to years behind bars. In the quiet that followed, Ramirez thought of Lena's empty apartment, of the lavender scent that still lingered there. He thought of a life cut short, and a world that needed to remember her for more than just the way she died. The courthouse was packed from the very first day of the trial. Reporters lined the steps outside, their cameras flashing every time a family member, attorney, or protester passed through the metal detectors. The case had already been splashed across every local newspaper and national outlet. Transgender woman murdered in her home. Suspect claims he was tricked. It was more than just a murder trial now. It was a cultural battlefield, a mirror reflecting the prejudices, fears, and anger simmering in society. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Rows of wooden benches were filled with members of the LGBTQ+ community wearing pins with Lena's name, her photo printed on laminated cards they held against their chests. On the opposite side sat a handful of Shaw supporters, mostly family members and a few locals who muttered about how he had been provoked. The air was electric, thick with division. The prosecution began with brutal clarity. Assistant District Attorney Kelly Monroe stepped before the jury, her voice steady but charged. She laid out the timeline. the break-in, the assault, the moment of discovery, and the eruption of violence that followed. The defendant did not kill out of confusion, she declared. He killed out of hate. He killed because he could not tolerate her existence. And in doing so, he tried to erase her humanity. Every word hung in the air like a hammer strike. The defense countered with a different narrative. Shaw's attorney, a wiry man named David Lawson, told the jury that his client had been deceived, that the revelation of Lena's identity had triggered a heat of passion that clouded his judgment. He leaned heavily on words like surprise, betrayal, and humiliation. He painted Shaw as a man who lost control, not as a predator. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Lawson said, pacing slowly before them, "this was not cold-blooded murder. This was a tragic mistake, a human reaction in a shocking moment." Gasps rippled through the gallery. For Lena's friends and supporters, the defense's words were like fresh wounds. Ramirez, seated near the back, clenched his fists. He had heard Shaw's excuses before, and now they were being polished into a courtroom strategy. Witness after witness was called. The medical examiner described the dozens of wounds, her voice steady as she explained how many were unnecessary to cause death, how they reflected rage rather than intent to kill swiftly. A crime scene analyst matched the bloody shoe prints to Shaw's sneakers. A neighbor recounted hearing muffled screams in the night, then silence. But the most powerful testimony came from Lena's friends. A co-worker from the bookstore described how Lena loved recommending novels to young readers, how she spent her lunch breaks journaling quietly in the corner. A volunteer from the LGBTQ+ Center described her as the one who always stayed late to clean up, even when no one asked. Her best friend took the stand, tears streaming as she held up a photograph of the two of them laughing at Pride. She wasn't trying to fool anyone, the friend said, voice breaking. She was just trying to live. She trusted the world enough to be herself, and that trust killed her. The courtroom fell silent. Even some jurors blinked back tears. Shaw sat stiff in his chair, eyes narrowed, jaw locked. He showed no remorse, no sign of regret. Only once did he break his composure, when the prosecution replayed his recorded statement from interrogation. His own voice filled the room, sneering. She wasn't real. The jurors shifted uncomfortably at the venom dripping from his words. When the defense put Shaw on the stand, hoping to humanize him, the move backfired. He spoke about his rough childhood, his drinking, his string of bad luck. But when pressed about Lena, his tone hardened. "She should have told me," he repeated again and again. "If she had, maybe she'd still be alive." The words echoed like nails on metal, cold and unapologetic. The prosecution seized on them in closing arguments. "Ladies and gentlemen," ADA Monroe said, pacing before the jury with fire in her eyes, "listen to what he just told you. He blames her for her own death. He blames the victim of his crime. That is not remorse. That is not heat of passion. That is hate, pure and simple. And hate is not a defense for murder." Outside the courthouse, crowds grew each day. Candlelight vigils were held for Lena, her face glowing on posters carried through the streets. Commentators on TV debated whether the trans panic defense, the claim that discovering someone was transgender excused violent reactions, should even be legal. Activists argued that Lena's case was proof that such defenses were nothing more than legalized prejudice. The jury deliberated for 2 full days. The city held its breath, waiting. On the afternoon of the third day, word spread that they had reached a verdict. Reporters scrambled to the courthouse steps, microphones ready. Inside, the tension was suffocating. Shaw stood as the foreperson read the decision. Guilty on all counts: burglary, sexual assault, and first-degree murder. The gallery erupted. Gasps, sobs, cheers, and shouts of relief filled the room. Lena's friends clutched each other, tears streaming, whispering her name. Outside, news cameras captured the moment her supporters raised their candles high, chanting justice for Lena. Shaw's face fell blank. No outburst, no protest, just emptiness, as if the weight of the sentence had finally crushed whatever defiance remained. The judge's gavel struck 3 sharp times, calling for order. The defendant will be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Shaw was led away in chains, Ramirez exhaled slowly. It wasn't joy he felt. It wasn't even relief. It was something heavier, the recognition that justice had been served in the courtroom, but the world outside remained fractured. Lena's death had exposed wounds far deeper than one man's hatred. That night, as candles burned on the courthouse steps and strangers held hands in mourning and solidarity, the city felt the ripple of her story. She was gone, but her name echoed in chants, headlines, and quiet prayers. And in that echo, perhaps, was the beginning of change. The final day of the trial ended not with applause or satisfaction, but with a heavy silence. The judge's gavel had fallen. Derek Shaw was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, and yet the courthouse still seemed to hum with the energy of something unfinished. For Lena's friends and family, justice had been declared on paper, but justice did not bring her back. As Shaw was led away in shackles, his eyes vacant, the gallery turned not to him, but to each other. They hugged, cried, whispered her name. The sound of chains dragging across the floor was swallowed by the voices of those who loved her, as if reclaiming the space he had stolen from her life. Outside, a crowd had gathered on the courthouse steps. When the news broke, cheers erupted, mixed with sobs. Dozens of candles flickered in the early evening air, their light dancing across posters that bore Lena's smiling face. Her name was chanted again and again, rising into the twilight, a defiant reminder that she would not be forgotten. But beyond the courthouse walls, the case reverberated across the country. News anchors framed it as a landmark moment, a trial that exposed the cruelty of the so-called trans-panic defense. Commentators debated late into the night. Was it enough that Shaw would spend the rest of his life behind bars? Or did Lena's death demand something bigger, a change in the law, a change in how society saw women like her? For weeks, Lena's story dominated headlines. Profiles of her life filled newspapers and blogs. How she worked at the bookstore downtown, how she volunteered her weekends at the LGBTQ+ center, how she always stopped to pet neighborhood dogs on her way home. She was no longer just the victim. She was Lena, a whole person, with laughter, dreams, and courage. Her friends insisted on that. She wasn't just what happened to her, one of them said at a vigil. She was what she gave to us every day. The sentencing also sparked waves of protest and policy discussions. Activists called for the elimination of panic defenses from courtrooms nationwide, arguing that they allowed prejudice to masquerade as justice. Legislators in several states introduced bills in Lena's name, urging that no one should ever again claim shock or humiliation as an excuse for murder. Her death, though senseless, became a rallying point. Detective Ramirez followed the coverage with mixed feelings. He had spent months piecing together every shard of evidence, staring into Shaw's hollow eyes across the interrogation table, listening to excuses steeped in venom. He had done his job, and the system had worked this time. Yet late at night, when the noise of the world quieted, he thought of Lena's apartment. The lavender candle melted on the dresser, the books stacked neatly by her bed, the half-finished journal entry on her desk. That was where her life had paused forever. No verdict could erase that image. At the LGBTQ+ center, where Lena once volunteered, a mural was painted on the brick wall, her portrait surrounded by vibrant colors, with the words she was real. She was loved. People left flowers beneath it. Strangers stopped to take photos, some lingering in silence, others whispering prayers. Her face became a symbol of resilience, but also a reminder of the violence that had tried to erase her. In prison, Shaw faded quickly from headlines. He became just another inmate serving a life sentence, his name spoken less and less as Lena's legacy grew louder. He had hoped, perhaps, that by blaming her he could preserve a shred of dignity, but the world turned its gaze from him to her. She was remembered. He was forgotten, a ghost behind concrete walls. Years later, those who knew Lena still gathered on the anniversary of her death. They lit candles, told stories, and reminded each other that she was more than a case file. Some brought copies of her favorite books to donate to libraries. Others shared how her courage to live openly had inspired them to step into their own truths. Her story lived on in courtrooms too. Law students studied the case as an example of how prejudice had once tried to mask itself as defense. Prosecutors cited it when challenging similar arguments. And slowly, laws began to change. States struck down panic defenses, citing Lena's name among the reasons. The apartment where she died was eventually rented out again, the walls painted over, the carpet replaced. To strangers, it was just another unit in a crumbling building. But to those who remembered, it was hallowed ground, a reminder of how fragile safety could be, how easily hatred could slip through a door at night. For Detective Ramirez, closing Lena's file years later brought no triumph, only a quiet vow. He kept a copy of her photo pinned to his bulletin board, not because he needed to remember the crime, but because he wanted to remember the person. The lavender smile, the quiet resilience, the humanity. And so, Lena's legacy became more than tragedy. It became a spark, one that lit protests, changed laws, and carried her memory into the future. She had been silenced in her own bedroom, but in death, her voice echoed louder than Shaw's rage ever could. In the end, the world knew her not as a victim who was tricked, but as a woman who was loved, who deserved to live, and whose story demanded that no one else should suffer the same fate.